welcome to this Angel seminar. My name is Douglas Bourne. I'm Professor of Development Education at University College London, and I'm also Chair of the Advisory Board for the Angel Network. For those of you who are not familiar with Angel, Angel is the academic network of global education and learning, and it's a network to bring together academics and early career researchers from all around the world. We currently have over 700 members, and today's seminar is part of a series of events and initiatives we're having around current key debates in the field, bringing together some of the leading figures in the area of global citizenship education from around the world. And I'm very pleased to invite Vanessa Andreotti to speak today, who's going to talk about her new book on Hospicing Modernity. So I'm very pleased to pass the floor over to Vanessa. You're very welcome.
Thank you so much, Doug. I would like to start with the usual way that we start things here in Canada, which is the acknowledgement of the lands that I'm speaking from. And I'm speaking from Stolo indigenous lands, ancestral and ceded indigenous lands in what is currently known as Maple Ridge. But I work at the University of British Columbia, which is on Musqueam indigenous territory as well. And I'm also coming from a hybrid family of German and indigenous ancestry. I was born and raised in Brazil. And from there is another kind of land acknowledgement. And this land acknowledgement is very long. It takes a whole day to happen, but I've tried to summarize it into four short acknowledgements. The first one is the acknowledgement of the land as a living entity, not a property or a resource. The second acknowledgement is the acknowledgement of our ancestors. And ancestors are not just those who have come before, but those also who are yet to come. And this acknowledgement brings with it the responsibility that what I say and what we talk about here today has implications, that has ripple implications, both towards the past and towards the future. And the third acknowledgement is the acknowledgement of all of those who have contributed for us to be here today, which includes the acknowledgement of our families, of the people, if it is a face-to-face gathering, of the people who have created the conditions for the gathering to take place, including the food and the land that produced the food and the hands that made the food. But in the context of online gatherings, it's important to acknowledge the communities where the computers are mined and the land as well, where these computers are mined and the violence inflicted on these communities in order for us to have the privilege and enjoy our online meetings. So that also brings a responsibility to both face the violence that is required to sustain our livelihoods and also to try to interrupt that violence through education, or at least reduce the violence. The fourth acknowledgement is the acknowledgement that we're all relations. There's a huge family of human and non-human beings that is currently experiencing disease, and that is the responsibility for healing, collective healing, the healing of our thinking, of our feelings, the healing of our relationships, the healing of our exchanges, and the healing of our sense of belonging to the planet itself, to the metabolism of the planet itself, which we're part of, and to the cycles of life and death. So that also requires the healing of our relationship with both life and death. So this framework actually comes from a network of indigenous communities in Brazil and in Canada that I work with, which is called Teia das Cinco Curas. And what we're going to be doing today is talking a little bit about the book through the work of the Gesturing Towards Decolonial Futures Arts Research Collective, which is the collective I belong to. We are also going to talk about a little bit about a course that is Creative Commons, so it's available for everyone, which is called Facing Human Wrongs. And we will finish talking about a campaign called Last Warning of the Federation of the Hunikui people of the Amazon, and which also works together with the collective, the Arts Research Collective that my work is situated with or in. So without more advanced warnings, I will share my presentation. Okay, so here we go. I will start by talking about the collective, and the book, what is in the book will be presented in some of the experiments of this collective. But because I don't work alone, I feel that the book itself, although it has my name on it, was not an individual project. So it's important, I think, to acknowledge that they are my lifeline. In 2015, I was about to give up on things, academia and everything else probably, but I found a group of people who have an affinity of inquiry and who has agreed to the integrity and depth of that inquiry. And for the last 7 years, we've been working together, and it has been incredible. So doing this collectively, I think it's the only way, but probably through the presentation, you'll see why that is the case. So my research and arts collective is a transdisciplinary collective of researchers, artists, educators, students, and indigenous knowledge keepers. We work at the interface of questions related to historical, systemic, and ongoing violence, and questions related to the unsustainability of our current habits of being. The collective brings together concerns related to racism, colonialism, unsustainability, climate change, biodiversity loss, economic instability, mental health crisis, and intensifications of social and ecological violence. So as you see, the content is extremely heavy. And what we specialize in is creating educational containers that are light and that help us sit with all of this in a very different way. So we're trying to build collective capacity, dispositions, and stamina for difficult work, which is around self and world unmaking through artistic and educational experiments where people can practice holding space for painful things without feeling overwhelmed, immobilized, or demanding quick fixes or to be rescued from discomfort. Our anchor of analysis is this idea of 4 denials, and this comes from a different kind of psychoanalysis. I would say it's a non-Western kind of psychoanalysis where we recognize that our unconscious has also been colonized. And this colonization restricts what we can feel, see, imagine, and the ways we can relate to each other, to ourselves, and to the world at large. So the first denial that we see reproduced in society is the denial of systemic violence and complicity in harm. The fact that our comforts, securities, and enjoyments are subsidized by expropriation and exploitation, that they exist at other people's and the planet's expense. And that's the case, for example, of the minerals that I mentioned before that are necessary for the creation of the technology that we use today, but that have been expropriated, right, through violent processes of land grabbing, of human exploitation, and of war. The second denial is the denial of the limits of the planet, the fact that the planet cannot sustain exponential growth and consumption. The third denial is the denial of entanglement, our insistence in seeing ourselves as separate from each other and the land rather than entangled within the living wider metabolism that is the planet that is biointelligent. And the fourth is the denial of the magnitude and complexity of the problem. The tendencies to look for hope in simplistic solutions that make us feel and look good, and to turn away from difficult work, sometimes using future forecasting or projective hope as an escape mechanism from the difficulties of the present. So our collective works with this idea that unprecedented global challenges are not fundamentally informational problems, but symptoms of a harmful habit of being marked by the 4 denials that I presented before. And this actually comes from Dwayne Donald, who is an Indigenous scholar who works here in Alberta. The second premise is that we are preparing for the end of the world as we know it. And this is an idea from Denise Ferreira da Silva, that she coined, that this idea of the end of the world as we know it, which is about surrendering the terms of our unsustainable existence based on extraction, exploitation, and overconsumption. So the steps towards us disinvesting in the continuity and futurity of a world that is fundamentally violent and unsustainable. We work with the idea of depth education and what I mentioned before, the non-Western cultural psychoanalysis, and we're going to talk a little bit about that today. We have engagements with indigenous communities based on trust, reciprocity, consent, and accountability, rather than extraction and appropriation. And we work with the idea of respect beyond idealization and romanticization of these communities. And we can talk about that later if you're interested in that. I didn't include that as the focus of this presentation, but we can talk about that later in the question and answers. We do engage in intellectual, artistic, embodied, and land-based education experiments, but today we're going to be focusing much more on the intellectual experiments. And then something that is probably very specific to our collective is that we recognize that vulnerabilities and complicities are distributed unevenly, in that we cannot turn our back to that. But we also say that no one is off the hook. So this means that we're not, although we are promoting, for example, that indigenous knowledges have a lot to teach us, we are not saying indigenous people have all the answers. We're saying that we're all complex, and even indigenous people are complicit in what's happening, although they have practices that can help us. They have helped our collective as well. But no one is off the hook in that sense. We all have a lot of work to do. And this slide is about shorthands that we have for some of the terms that you're going to hear today. And as you know, the idea that words have different layers of meaning, and in different contexts, they are used in different ways. So in our collective, we're not about fixing words, but about just clarifying how we're using them and acknowledging that other people will use them with different meanings. And we don't say that the dictionary meaning is the one that defines the words, because that was, again, a decision that somebody made of talking about that layer of meaning of that word. But anyway, so the way we would use colonization, for example, we say that colonization is often understood as the occupation of lands and subjugation of peoples. But here in our collective, we use it to talk about the forceful imposition of separability, the separation between us and nature and us and each other. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. Colonialism is generally referred to as a practice of domination, hierarchization, and extermination. And yes, we agree with that, but we also say that it's also a harmful, restrictive, and pleasurable habit of being. So we say usually that colonialism is delicious, and that's why it's very difficult to interrupt and very easy to continue. We also use the word coloniality, which refers to the ongoing effects of colonialism, even when formal colonization has ended or is invisibilized. We talk about modernity, which is a particular, omnipresent, dynamic, single story of progress, development, evolution, and civilization. And that's as a shorthand. We will talk more about that in a bit. We talk about modernity / coloniality, which underscores the fact that violence is the other side of the coin of modernity. It's necessary for it to exist. There's no modernity without colonial violence. We also talk about decolonization, which is the end of formal occupation and subjugation. That's how it's generally understood. But in our collective, we talk about decolonization as the rematriation of lands in the land back movement here in Canada. And we say that no decolonization can be done without indigenous peoples. Decolonization is not a metaphor, as Yvtak also emphasizes. And we use the word decoloniality to talk about the end of the world as we know it, as I said, the term that Denise Ferreira da Silva uses, which is not the end of the world, period. It's just the end of a harmful and unsustainable world. In the book, Hospicing Modernity is all about that, all about how we hospice something that is violent and unsustainable without trying to kill it necessarily or murder it. And how do we offer prenatal care for worlds that are emerging out of the ashes of this without suffocating it with projections and idealizations. So we are not saying how do we give birth for something else, because that centers us again in the process. We're saying how do we assist with prenatal care and maybe midwifery of what is being born. And what's being born may not necessarily be by humans. It may be that it's the land itself that will birth another possibility of existence and coexistence for us. Or it may be that we have passed the tipping point where we have already contributed to our premature extinction to a point where we cannot go back, in which case what we need to do is figure out how to go through this process in a more generative way without killing each other. So we also have a very strong critique of decolonization being used as a currency or for consumption or as a fad or a fetish. And this is one example of the things that we are not invested in and that we have a critique of. This decolonized yoga stainless steel water bottle has come to represent for us one of the ways that decolonization now is being used as a fad. And there's nothing we can do to stop it, but it also has detrimental effects, especially for the struggles of indigenous peoples, right? So if we use decolonization just to talk about everything we don't like, we are actually trivializing struggles where lives are on the line. And we are trying to promote more self-reflexive engagement with that. The other thing that is different about what we do is that we have a very strong analysis, I think, of our complex socio-educational context right now. So when we talk about educational interventions, we are not intervening in the context where I grew up, for example, in the 80s and 90s. We're intervening in a completely different context where there's a very strong and very large intergenerational gap, or there are intergenerational gaps. And of course, caused by technology and other factors. But mainly, I think what we see today in the context that we intervene is the influence of algorithmic capitalism. So algorithmic capitalism has had an effect on how educational contexts are going to operate. And the first effect is that we will always see a cacophony of perspectives, which can be positive or negative, which also Bakhtin has referred to as heteroglossia. But in many contexts, this means information and misinformation overload, the impossibility of stable authorities or imposed consensus. There's always going to be transgressive movements within the space, also because the teacher doesn't have, or the instructor or the facilitator doesn't have the authority to impose anything, and Google has 1,000 different answers for the same question, right? So this has changed fundamentally. The second one is an oversaturation of unprocessed emotions. There's a lack of resilience and collective capacity to process complex emotions within and around us. There's also VUCA, which is increased volatility, uncertainty, social complexity, and ambiguity, which usually leads to social fragmentation and polarized perspectives on the common good. There's also this sense of meta-consumption. And here is not just the consumption of goods, but also the consumption of relationships, the consumption of experiences, of critique, of knowledge, but consumption as a mode of relating to the world. There are incentives and rewards for hedonistic, narcissistic, and hyper-individualistic behaviors, and this meta-entitlement to curate reality, as you do on social media. Then there is self-infantilization, a proliferation of fragilities and entitlements, a demand for coddling and for likes on Facebook, which has been described by some of the indigenous people we work with as the failure of the Western culture to produce grown-ups. There's a focus on feeling and looking good, and as I said before, hope as or seen in projection rather than relational weaving. So here we think about hope as this image of a harmonious and better future, and the idea that we can plan to get there if you have that image, rather than thinking about what's wrong in the present and what has been severed and what needs repair in the present, which is difficult work to do. We talk about it as the work of composting historical, systemic, collective, and individual shit in order to turn the shit into new soil. So people usually don't like composting shit. Some people don't know how to, and they use hope as an escape from that, as a way of feeling better without having to do the work that is necessary. We also see a context of intergenerational resentment. Now that the limits of the planet have been reached and the promises of endless prosperity have been broken, young people have described this to us as this is something like watching a train wreck in slow motion. And when we were having that discussion, we have the discussion often, but the first time we were having that discussion, it was interesting because the person who said that said, yes, it's watching a train wreck in slow motion, and I still want the Gucci bag. So it's the different layers of investment and desires the young people have of seeing the planet at the state it's at, of blaming other generations for doing it, but also not yet completely disinvesting in having the things that create the problems they are critiquing. So all these things are important to keep in mind. So having said that, I'm going to just show you one of the things that we do as an example to try to engage with that context that I've just talked about in a different way. So we usually deploy a lot of metaphors, stories, analogies, figurations, body exercises, song. What's coming a lot with the young people, we have a youth collective associated with our collective. It's much more work with sound and much more work with things that are not necessarily languageable. But and we talk about the fact that like the intellect is just 20% of the work that needs to be done. All the rest actually is in the body. As I said today, as I said before, today we're focusing more on this 20%. And the House Modernity Built is a map. We call it a social cartography that helps us zoom out from our immediate context. So it's a step back to be able to see the context, the wider context in a different way so that we can mobilize different kinds of discussions. And it has come from the literature. The first iteration of it was from the literature, but it has been workshopped with several communities, both in the North and in the South, including indigenous communities, and it has been modified. So we have several versions of it, and we choose the version according to the context that we are going to work in. So this is the version I chose for you. It's a story, it's a long story. I'm going to try to shorten it for the presentation. So this is the story of the House Modernity Built. And the first frame of the story is a house sitting on a planet, and this house exceeds the limits of the planet. So the house is built on a foundation of separability, which is the separation between us and the land, us and each other, us and the other animals. And that separability creates hierarchies of worth, where the intrinsic value of life is taken away. There's an intrinsic sense of worthlessness, and you have to produce value within the house in order to justify deserving being alive. And then you have all these different ranks, including meritocracy as the ranking systems, scoring systems within the house. The house also has two carrying walls. The first wall is the nation state. The second wall is universal reason. The wall of the nation state is one where we generally think about the nation state as being there to protect people, but actually historically it has been created to protect property and the protection of people through the dispensation of human rights, civil rights, labor rights, has only happened when these protections are in convergence with the protection of property. So this is something that we ask people to pay attention to, because we often forget, but that the nation state as with the function of protecting and securing property or capital is one of the carrying walls. The second carrying wall is the carrying wall of universal reason. Universal reason is the single story of progress, development, civilization, and human evolution that tends to delegitimize and kill other stories. So Boaventura de Souza Santos talks about this killing as epistemicide. It kills other possibilities, other ideas of forward, other understandings of progress, other understandings of civilization or development. And then you have a roof of global capital, which today is a shareholder, speculative, algorithmic capital or capitalism, which is a structurally damaged roof, which is different from the roofs of socialism and the roofs of industrial capitalism. Some people would call it as the new iteration of neoliberalism. And it is structurally damaged because it's focused on anonymity and profit, and it doesn't carry the same levels of social responsibility as industrial capitalism and socialism were proposing. Right? So the interest in people and collectivities is not there. In the second frame, we have the house with the arrows there, and underneath it, the house subsidized and maintained by violence. So here we are reminded that the house was created by colonialism and imperialism. And inside the house, we have unsustainable growth and overconsumption. And one of the arrows is expropriation of resources from the planet into the house, and then waste disposal from the house into the planet. In the planet, we have destitution, dispossession, and genocide, which are the hidden costs of the building and the maintenance of this house. The third frame, which are the floors, talks about the false promise of universal middle class. So we're thinking about, when we think about social justice, for example, or even the sustainable development goals, we're talking about the expansion of the house, but the expansion of the house has a cost, which we saw in the other frame. And we promise people in the house that they can climb the social mobility ladder. But in order for everybody in the planet to have access to even kind of modest levels of consumption that we have in the global north, we would need 4 to 6 planets. So the planet has limits here. So in the house, we have the penthouse, which is the north of the north, people with historical access to disposable income and long-term access to disposable income. And then we have the north of the south, which is people who are invested in social mobility and the stairs of social mobility. There's the south of the north, which is the basement of the house, generally people who provide services for the north of the south and the north of the north. And we have the south of the south, where the people who are receiving the sewage of the house are trying to find for different forms of existence. So we work, for example, with the Federation of the Hunikui people in the Amazon, who are putting their lives on the line to protect the forest, again, mining, logging, and the Bolsonaro government. And they do not want to live in the house. They want some of the securities to be able to protect their territories, but they can't. They say that this is not what we want. But there might be no possibility if their territories are taken or if their lands are contaminated. They will have to knock on the door and say, you have completely taken away the possibility of a different form of existence, and this is the only option now, right? But the people fighting in the south of the south are generally those who want an alternative, to protect an alternative form of existence, and who can see the problems within the house and of the house itself. So the last frame, we're looking at climate change, economic instability, cancellation of rights, precarity, populism, weighing on the structurally damaged roof and creating mold within the house and cracks. So we see socioeconomic, political, ecological, and mental health crisis. And in the planet, we see violent conflict and mass and forced migration. So here is where we have to ask the questions. Do we fix the house, we expand the house, we build another house? Do we live without a house, or do we find more planets? And here is where the work of the collective and the work of the book as well, the Hospicing Modernity book, that's where that's where the work lies, the kinds of questions and the kinds of possibilities we have, both intellectually, relationally, affectively, to be able to sit with what's difficult about these questions in order to open up the very possibility of different possibilities becoming viable. And when we sit with those questions, generally we have three different kinds of answers. The first answer is there's a soft reform of the house that is necessary. The second answer is that the house needs radical reform, or the house is beyond reform. So when people come to the questions with a soft reform orientation, they want more modernity, the same forward, like the house is fine, same leadership, just small changes. So we have same usual questions and same answers. When people want to do radical reform of the house, we generally hear that we need still more modernity, but different leadership in larger changes. It's same questions, but different answers. When people come with the orientation of this house is beyond reform, they see that more modernity is not an option, given the violence required and the limits of the planet. Then we have the possibility of different questions and different answers. And we work with, when we are, for example, doing a session with an organization or with students at the university or with teachers, we see that in a room you can have several people with different with these different orientations, but sometimes we have the three orientations within us. So we also have tools to talk about our inner complexity, how we sit with the complexity that we see on our own bus. We talk about the bus within us. So there's a bus with a driver and passengers at the front, in the middle, and at the back, and they may have different perspectives on things. And we say that if we do not create the psychoanalytic distance to sit with our complexities, our internal complexities, there's no chance that we're going to be able to sit with the complexities outside of us or around us. We also talk about the adjacent possible, what's viable but unimaginable, and we take inspiration from what we see in the communities that we work with, the indigenous communities, both in Brazil, Peru, and Canada. So here we have something that came up as a metaphor there too. So we have the mushrooms of ecological justice and economic justice. So you know that mushrooms are fruit of the organism that is the mycelium, which stays underneath the earth, right, in the soil. So we cannot have ecological and economic justice without cognitive justice, affective justice, and relational justice. But one thing that was interesting is that although we started with the concept of justice, the communities, indigenous communities, when we were workshopping this, said justice is not a concept we would like to work with, because this is not a problem of justice, it's a problem of a disease, and we need to talk about healing. So ecological healing and economic healing can only happen when we heal our ways of thinking, our ways of feeling and processing emotions, and our ways of relating to each other, which is much more difficult when we talk about it in terms of justice. Because justice is, again, this idea of putting the hope in this image in the future of what it should be, rather than working through the difficulties of the present. This is what we've been taught. So back to education, in global education specifically, there are common assumptions in education that are very problematic. So the first assumption, and that we try to challenge in our collective, is that talking about negative things make people feel demotivated, that complexity causes people to feel overwhelmed, that exposing complicities makes people feel uncomfortable, that lack of simple solutions immobilizes people, that uncertainty makes people feel anxious, that suggesting that that big changes are coming can make people feel hopeless or angry. So from this set of assumptions, we see a very strong move in global education to make it short, make it simple, make it easy, make it light, make it fun, and make it hopeful. So that's not what we do. What we do is we create a distinction between this positive education, or what we call sometimes mastery education, which is to give people a content for a cup, and that feels like conquering a peak. And we distinguish that from depth education, which is much more akin to peeling the onions of things and crying a lot in the process, or as opposed to conquering a peak, it's more about deep diving in the freezing ocean and figuring out that we're both water, our bodies are mostly water, that we are also the water of the ocean, and the toxins and pollutants that we ourselves put into it. So we are very much about connecting with everything, but everything means connecting with the good, the bad, the ugly, the broken, and the messed up as well, not just with the flowers, the moon, and the sun, or the whales. So we have to connect with the shit as well, so that we can learn to compost it. So the kind of depth education questions are different from mastery or positive education questions. And they include these 3 questions that I put here. How do we prepare ourselves to tackle the wicked problems of our time, including unprecedented complex dilemmas and also disasters of our own making that we will have to face together? How can we learn to do the kindest and most responsible thing to each other and to the land at all times, especially in times of crisis and polarization? How can we learn to choose sobriety, maturity, discernment, and accountability in a culture of late modernity that often promotes and rewards the opposite? So these kinds of questions we brought to a course called Facing Human Wrongs. It was first a course offered by UBC, and it was an interdisciplinary course. And the story of the course is interesting because when we went to ask if we could do a course like this, we said, we want a course that will open up cans of worms and it won't coddle the students. And the people at UBC said, well, we are in a pandemic and we have an endemic crisis amongst the students of an increase of anxiety, depression, and self-harm. Are you sure this is the best option to offer a course like this, right? So our response, we had to think about it too in that context, right? So our response was that, yes, for some people, opening up the complexities of things can indeed increase the anxiety, depression, and self-harm. But for other people, and increasingly so, it is because we are not opening the complexities of things, we're saying everything is going to be fine. This is what is causing the anxiety, depression, and self-harm. However, people would need to self-select in this case, because if we give the wrong kind of education to the wrong group of people, we might be, there's an ethics to that, right? So we created a unit, the first unit of the course, and this is all available online for free for everybody. The first unit of the course invites people to go through 7 different things. They have the 7 different things for all the units. It's 6 units. But the first unit, there's a lecture, there are exercises, intellectual exercises, there are readings, but there's also a forest walk, an engagement with artistic and popular culture, artistic practices and popular culture. And there is a questionnaire saying, is this course for me? And in this questionnaire, we talk about both how people, people's ability to face complexity, uncertainty, ambiguity, and volatility. So the questionnaire really gets people to sit with their own moment and space, head and heart space, and ask them, is this course a good thing for you? Now that you have done a taster, check your bus and see if you should take this course right now. The other thing that we did in the course that was really, really interesting at the time was that students had to create learning journals about each of the units, about what they had engaged with, and they had to choose between 4 options, like whether or not they require feedback from the instructors, and if they didn't require feedback, they would say, I'm just okay, or I can't handle it at the moment. And then if they require feedback, if they wanted sugar-coated feedback, honest feedback, or brutally honest feedback. This was also an incredibly fruitful exercise to get people to think about where they were at, where they wanted to go, and to invite the instructors in the process in a very different way. So the course also started from the premise that our current education creates a specifically subjectivity that is poorly equipped to navigate volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. So this subjectivity that we have in our mainstream education makes us attracted to certainty, control, familiarity, safety, and convenience. Makes us afraid of uncertainty, belittlement, shame, worthlessness, and irrelevance. It makes us also feel discomfort with complicity, ambiguity, paradoxes, and contradictions, and it creates a desire for moral authority, unaccountable autonomy, and the arbitration of justice and common sense. So the course tries to get us into a very different space to deal with wicked problems, because from that subjectivity, when we face wicked challenges in multiple crises, we are unable actually to sit with all these things with sobriety, maturity, discernment, and accountability. So the course is trying to create a compass towards sobriety, maturity, discernment, and accountability through an invitation for decentering, disarming, decluttering, and disinvesting in harmful desires. And this invitation also to walk the tightrope between naive hope and desperate hopelessness with both intellectual and relational rigor, but with honesty. It's 4 H's: honesty, humility, humor, and hyper self-reflexivity. And in this course, what we try to do is also different from what positive or mastery education tries to do in terms of dispositions for navigating the complexities and paradoxes of global change. So we're trying to create for people this sense of diffractive assessment, which is the idea of layering the self and layering reality in order to articulate complexities and paradoxes and be able to hold space for that. We also talk about diachronic and analectic reasoning. So this, what I'm sharing with you, is the internal pedagogical language that we have for creating the exercises. Diachronic and analectic reasoning is about connecting dots in the bigger picture across time and non-dialectically. And if you want to talk more about that, we can talk about that in the Q&A. We also we're trying to create psychoaffective stamina, which is this idea of holding space for difficulties and discomfort without being overwhelmed, immobilized, or demanding quick fixes or rescue. Ontosympathetic resonance, which is about tuning into the pain of others in oneself and interrupting harmful desires and perceived entitlements. We are talking about heteroglossic dexterity, which is about navigating the ambivalence of language and cacophony of perspectives in a generative way, and the SMDR compass calibration, which is about moving towards decolonial forms of sobriety, maturity, discernment, and responsibility or accountability as we face shadows, compass shit, and I can't read that because there's this thing on top of it, compass shit and face storms together, probably. So this is like what we're trying to develop pedagogically in the course, and we have a group of people looking at this in more detail, and we're trying to see if we can translate these things into pedagogical articles that can help create other spaces as well in different contexts. We use also Flipgrid, and this has been a huge surprise, a pleasant surprise. So people who are doing the course now, so the course is not just at UBC now, the course is open. to different groups, especially people who have read the Hospicing Modernity book and they want to continue the journey and establish a practice. So we have 4 courses running at the moment, one on social innovation and organizational change, one on that is exclusive for caucusing for IBPOC people, Black, Indigenous, and people of color. We have a course focused on higher education and global education, and we have a general interest course, and each one has about 10 people. And after each unit, we invite people to share a video on Flipgrid in response to certain questions. And it is fascinating to witness and accompany people in this journey. So we are thinking even of creating a series with the best illustrations of this learning process. And we are thinking about approaching Netflix with that. So that takes me back to the last thing that I wanted to talk about, which is the University of the Forest Global Education Project. And just going back to the Facing Human Wrongs, we are using Facing Human Wrongs when we open that up to the public as a fundraising strategy for the University of the Forest Global Education Project, which is a project of the Honikui Federation of Indigenous People in the Amazon. And so the project started last year with an emergency in Brazil, where the Federation of the Honikui people, who are our research collaborators, have been for more than 7 years. They came to us together with other communities who are also part of the network and said, we need help. There's an emergency, that 22 bills being passed in Congress by the Bolsonaro government, but beyond that too, it's generally lobbyists from the mining, logging, and agribusiness industries that are putting this bills through. And there is a Supreme Court landmark case that is going to take away our lands, cancel our rights, in order to open up the Amazon and other sensitive areas to predatory industries. So we stopped everything that we were doing last summer to support people and we were under their direction to do that. So they wanted to take people to the protests in Brasilia, and where there were 12,000 indigenous people. And they wanted us to fundraise for drones and for body cameras to document human rights violations in their territories. So we started to put everything that we do in service, both our intellectual capacity and mobilization capacity, but also what we were doing in terms of global education. We started offering this in a redistribution way, so that whatever income came from presentations in organizations, in universities, or in groups, all the income would go and be redistributed towards this project. And we talked about it as a North-South collaboration grounded on carbon debt reparations. So last year, what happened was that there was a conflict between Bolsonaro and the Supreme Court, and also the protests. So they delayed the voting of this Supreme Court case. But the Supreme Court case now is coming back, and it's going to be voted in June together with the other bills. Now that it's election year in Brazil, Bolsonaro government wants to pass everything he can until October, because there's no guarantee that Bolsonaro is going to be reelected, but there is a possibility still. So this year, we have been asked to support with something else, because the communities are now at a different space and thinking that it may pass. And if it passes, it's going to be another wave of genocide. We are working more with precautionary measures. So we are going to be this month and next month fundraising for the purchase of refuge land for people who may be dispossessed, which is also going to be the base of the University of the Forest Honikui side of the project. And we will have one then in Canada, a University of the Forest Global Education Project in Canada, to work with schools and universities as well as organizations to try to bring this idea of depth education to schools and to support this North-South collaboration grounded on carbon debt reparations. So as part of that too, we have a carbon debt reparations pledge, which we started actually in February, where we're asking tenured professors to sign, where you say, I recognize that academic air travel is a significant contributor to carbon emissions. Therefore, as a tenured academic, I pledge to only travel long distance for essential research with communities and family reunions. As I prioritize online participation in academic conferences, and as I recognize that the technological apparatus is also sourced from systemic violence, I will redistribute the funding allocated for conference travel to indigenous communities in the Global South who are most affected by the climate crisis and who are putting their lives on the line to protect sensitive areas that are crucial for our collective survival. I think with that, I think what I'll do, I'll stop and take the questions. So I thank you for listening to me today. The decolonialfutures.net is the website of our collective. Facing Human Wrongs course can be found on the second link, and the Last Warning campaign is the last one. So thank you.
Thank you, Vanessa. Very rich presentation and whole number of issues and points that I'm sure people will want to raise. That was really great. So thank you. So, and I do encourage everyone to get hold of the book. I found it a really interesting read. I read it the last couple of days and really, well, thought-provoking, really. You know, hard, you know, not easy, but really great, really thought-provoking. So thanks everyone, and we'll be in touch about forthcoming events. So thanks everyone for coming, and have a safe evening. Thank you.